So just very quickly, some background information. This demonstration project is a grant from the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, and it actually is funding that comes from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And Tracy Thomas, our project officer sitting in the back, is here today observing, but CDC is the ultimate funder of this project. Hopefully we're not under attack yet. We do, because we're giving CME credits, we do have a couple of disclosures and attributions to make. So Mary and I are with the University at Albany School of Public Health, and Carla Vermeulen, who you'll meet and will do a lot of the talking today, is with the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. So that's our organizational affiliations. And this program is also co-sponsored by the University at Albany School of Social Work for the social work continuing education credits. And because we're giving credits, we have no conflicts of interest to disclose. We're not selling anything today or getting any kickbacks from the presentations today. So we are offering a variety of continuing education credits for physicians, for nursing, for social work, and there's a slightly different way to do it depending on which types of credits you're getting, and it's outlined on this slide, and we can reiterate it. I think the main thing to say is if you're getting social work credits, there's a separate sign up in the back, but you'll need to go online to get your certificate of the credits. For everybody else who's getting credits, you need to just complete the pre and post evaluation form and hand it in before you leave, and we'll handle mailing you the certificates at the end of the day. If you have questions about this as we go along, Mary in the back can starve you to death. Just in terms of introductions, this is our information, including contact information that's in the slides as well. So again, Gus Burkhead in the back, Mary Riley Hockamay with the University of Albany, and Dr. Carla Vermeulen from the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz, and a couple of other folks who are part of our team who aren't here today. How it works. So I'm going to briefly talk about what PFA is and isn't. Dr. Vermeulen will go into some more detail here. And how many people were actually able to take the online course, the Minnesota course? Just a sense. So many did. That course has some challenges in trying to access it sometimes, but so we appreciate it takes a little effort. So that's the kind of information that's helpful. But that's a good short course. But basically, it describes, so psychological first aid is really just a set of early intervention tools to help responders address stress-related reactions in survivors immediately following a disaster. It can also be used, as I said, to help with stress among first responders themselves. And I think we sort of think of it, psychological first aid relates to mental health services as regular first aid relates to medical services. So if you come across someone bleeding in the street, if you know first aid, you can stop the bleeding, you can stabilize, you can sort of assess whether somebody needs to go to a higher level of care or not. Same thing with psychological first aid. Sort of assess, stabilize, take some steps to get the person going again, and recognize if they need a higher level of care. So most response workers are not mental health professionals. Most survivors don't need a mental health professional potentially, but the response workers need to be able to help stabilize people and get them going, and then help to recognize whether they need a higher level of care. So that's where the first aid part of this comes in. We've said a couple times that PFA is really evidence-informed. We use the term evidence-based a lot when we have a study that has a group that got psychological first aid and didn't and show a difference. You can't really do that kind of study very easily. So we say psychological first aid is evidence-informed, and Carla will talk more about that. But there's some good basis for it. It's never been tested out, and I don't think you could really test it out in a real situation. And it basically, you shouldn't think of it as a separate thing from just the responders working with the survivors. It's just the first step. How do you break the ice? How do you get a conversation going? How do you identify what the primary needs of the person are? How do you help them deal with their stress so that you can then get into what they need and how you can get them what they need? So it's not really a separate thing. It's just part of how you respond to people, survivors in an event. And the goals, really, Carla will talk much more about this. You want people to feel safe. You want to help them, reduce some stress-related symptoms and foster positive coping strategies. That's really what it's about. So you can get over the hump of the stress that they're under to identify what they need and how you can help them meet those needs. And it also allows the response workers to better meet those basic needs. And this slide really is just to make the point that psychological first aid is really for everybody who's involved in a response. It's not just the intake person. It could be the people in the food line who are interacting with people and recognizing that people are under stress, and how do you make a quick connection and try to help them relieve that stress or get them more help if they need that help. So it's really something that everybody who's involved in a response who would interact with the public might want to know some basic skills, but also workers who may be in the back room in a response who are under stress themselves to understand how to work with their coworkers around stress reduction. It's the same set of tools that you would use. So I think we just want to be clear what it is not. Psychological first aid is not mental health counseling. We're not trying to turn everybody into mental health counselors, but it might help identify people who need that. And it's obviously not something that needs to be delivered by a mental health professional. It's something anybody should be able to do in the course of interacting with survivors or with coworkers. So any response workers should be able to do it. And you don't need to have a Hurricane Sandy or a massive snowstorm to do psychological first aid. You can do it on smaller scale disasters. If someone's been burned out of their home, that's, they're feeling it just as bad as a community who's just undergone a hurricane or a tornado. So it can be scaled. It really is the one-on-one interaction with the response worker. When we came in, the fire folks here who were using their facility said, "Oh, well, we need that too, because we deal with people, when they're at the curbside out there inside their home that's been burned down. We need those same kinds of skills," and that's true. This is a skill that not just for public health workers or healthcare workers, but for any responders.
So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about patterns that we recognize with disasters and characteristics of disasters and patterns of reactions that we tend to see resulting from those characteristics. But I'll sort of undermine my own message by saying, always keep in mind that even though what I'm talking about is kind of group level patterns, that does not mean that every individual is going to follow that same track or have that same pattern of reaction. So, the people were not the same going into the event. I think one of the issues with disasters is because there are these collective events, it's easy to kind of default to this cookie cutter. Well, everyone in this community went through the same hurricane, ice storm, shooting, whatever it was. Therefore, they're all going to have the same results, the same outcomes. And of course, that's not true. They had different resources going into it. They had different stressors going into it, different life experiences, different social connections, different amounts of money, whatever it was. And they didn't experience it the same way. People's perceptions of what happened don't always directly reflect what actually happened. And so what we need to understand is what their perception of it was. And then how they're treated afterwards is going to be different. Unfortunately, we tend to view some populations as more worthy of our sympathy and support after a disaster. I mean, think about, the different amounts of donations that come in after certain events, depending on who they impacted. So it basically, all of these things are going to combine. So main point that I'm belaboring, I know, is just you always want to be dealing with the individual who's in front of you and getting what their reactions are. But it also is really helpful to think, okay, I am about to go in to or be deployed to a response to X event. Therefore, I can generally expect these kinds of reactions. So the characteristics that we find, and this is based on some research and also just some anecdotal and response experience by not just me, but many people in the field, that these reactions tend to correlate with the size of the event, the cause of the event, whether we had a warning for it, was it expected or not, and then when did it happen. So I will talk through each of these in turn. So size is very hard to define because whether something we're going to consider kind of a large size event really depends on the resources that are available to deal with that event. But generally we can break this down into scope, intensity, and duration, and that is basically how big, bad, and long was it. So scope is kind of the geographic size of it, generally, just how many people were affected, as opposed to intensity, which is how badly were they affected. Now, often those two things correlate with each other, but sometimes they don't. I mean, you could have a wildfire that burns, 1,000 acres, but if they're unpopulated, we're not really going to consider that to be terribly large in terms of intensity. On the other hand, I always use the example for this of everyone remember the nightclub or the station nightclub fire from 10 or 12 years ago in Rhode Island, where the band set off the pyrotechnics, set the soundproofing on fire, fire spread incredibly rapidly, and 100 people were killed in that fire. And many more were injured, and certainly many more escaped but were deeply traumatized by it. That one is high in intensity because of the number of deaths, but it was confined to one building. So the hospitals in the area were still functioning, schools were functioning, churches were open. So again, there's this kind of interplay where it's very hard to sort of say, okay, this is defined as X scope or this X intensity. So this frustrates my students deeply, but how many people have to be killed for it to be high in intensity? It doesn't work that way. It's all relative. And it's relative to that community and, again, what their resources are for responding to something. Then duration is also kind of hard to, or it's measured in a bunch of different ways. We can think about how long was the actual event itself, but, an event can last from weeks if you've got a flood that's very slowly rising and receding. An event could be seconds if it's an explosion or an earthquake. So I don't think that's a very useful gauge of the duration of it. I think what is most useful is how long is it until people feel safe, until they feel that the event is over, because they really can't start recovering from it or adjusting to it or even processing what they've been through and what they've lost until they feel safe again. So restoring that sense of safety is one of the major components of PFA, which we'll talk about. So all of these matter because we talk about a dose-response relationship, which to anyone in healthcare is probably a familiar term. Same thing applies here. The bigger the dose that someone experiences in 1, 2, or 3 of these measures, the more likely it is that they're going to have a stronger negative reaction, a longer lasting negative reaction, et cetera. Total common sense, but it is backed up by the research. Then causality, was it human caused or natural, act of God? We don't use that term so much any longer, but this is a little bit less of a bright line than it might seem to be, even though this is kind of the classic way that we describe disasters. Think about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the flooding that happened in the city of New Orleans specifically. Was that human caused or natural? Both, yes. Good. The hurricane obviously was natural. So we can think of, the destruction that it caused throughout the rest of the Gulf Coast. That was a natural disaster. In New Orleans specifically, a large component of that was human caused because it was the levees that had been badly designed and badly maintained, and they failed, and that's what really caused the destruction in the city. So you can have these kind of combination events. Sometimes we call them NATEC. A natural event leads to a technical disaster. Can anyone think of an example of that from a few years ago that caused massive? Sandy, I would describe as pretty much natural, although it certainly did cause, it's technical failures in terms of like the subways. And so, how about Japan? Yeah, so you had, natural underground earthquake caused natural tsunami, and that caused massive destruction throughout the country. But that also wiped out a poorly sited nuclear power plant and caused the technical failure there, which then caused massive destruction and displaced permanently, another 100,000 or whatever it was people. So again, it's not always totally clear. What matters here again is the person's perception of what the cause was, because that's really going to lead to who they blame for it. That blaming issue is kind of the biggest factor that comes out in terms of thinking about causality. What we usually see is that for natural events, there's generally less of a negative reaction to them. And a lot of that is just because we don't think of them as preventable. There's no one to blame. I mean, you can blame God, certainly, and many people will do that, and that can have a significant impact on their faith and their recovery. But generally, these things just happen, so we have to accept that they happen. The flip side of that is that we are powerless in the face of natural disasters. We can take certain actions, but we can't prevent the next hurricane from happening. We can't prevent the next tornado, earthquake, you name it. And we don't like that. I think American culture, many cultures do not like that sense of being powerless, of being helpless. So that's very sort of disturbing for people and destabilizing, because we couldn't prevent the last one from happening and causing this destruction, and that means we can't prevent the next one from happening. So that's very upsetting for people. Of course, we have the flip side of this with human-caused events. In these cases, there is a strong drive to find someone to blame, and sometimes it's clear who is to blame. The shooter was to blame. The hijacker was to blame. The person who was driving the train while texting was to blame. Now, in many cases, if there is someone to blame and they have been caught, or they didn't die in the process of the event themselves, there can be the pursuit of justice. Sometimes that's not an option. Sometimes there's more of a desire for vengeance or punishment. If you can seek justice and you get justice and the person is punished for what they did, that can be very comforting for people, but that's not a guaranteed outcome. And even just the pursuit of that justice can last for years in many cases. And so it just kind of keeps the reactions raw. It kind of, tears the Band-Aid off every time there's another kind of step in those criminal proceedings. In many cases, of course, the person who was responsible is dead, and so we can't get justice against them or punishment against them. So in that case, often what happens is we look for someone else to blame. We look, and in hindsight, you can always find someone who could have done a better job. Yeah, maybe the authorities should have recognized that these people shouldn't have, those hijackers shouldn't have been taking flying lessons. Maybe we should have had better safety policies in place. Whatever it was, we can find someone to blame. And the problem with that is often people sort of get fixated on this need, to find the blame, to find the punishment. And so that can really kind of get them stuck in their adjustment process. So that's certainly something to watch out for. I also always think it's important to think about how intentional was the event. I mean, we can certainly have events that are human-caused, but that were purely accidental, as opposed to due to negligence or intentional. So think about a little thought experiment here. Imagine that you have just found out that a loved one has been killed in a plane crash because the plane took off, flew into a flock of geese that had been surrounding the airport. The pilots were not able to recover control of the craft. It crashed, and everyone on board was killed. How does this make you feel? Terrible, right? Terrible. It's horrible. This is not, I'm not saying this is not awful. It's awful. Who do you blame? The geese. Yeah, okay. You blame the geese. The geese are dead. You can't really get much vengeance against the geese, right? Who else do you blame? So we've got the pilots. Yeah, you can blame the pilots. Sure, that those other pilots were able to land their plane safely when the same thing happened. Why couldn't these? The pilots are dead. You're not going to get much. The airline. Okay, why the airline? You can sue them. Yeah.
Well, this is a suit time now. People are
sure.
So they're going to go after it so much.
Yes, of course the airline's going to settle first, but yes, right. You can get some financial compensation from the airline, absolutely, and that is commonly done. Who else? Someone said the government. Why the government?
Well, they didn't control the geese population.
Okay, Okay, sure. It could have been, right, government didn't control the geese, or you could say that, the airline authorities should have recognized this was a threat and done something about it. You could blame Boeing for not designing their plane engines to be bird strike proof. You can find someone to blame, right? Is that going to be your main response, the main feature in your loss and your bereavement? Probably not. Probably not. It may be a little factor in there, but it's not going to be the main point. Now your loved one has died. Well, up here I can just say your loved one died in the Colgan air crash, because you all know the circumstances of that, I'm sure, right? Pilots were fatigued, newly trained on that aircraft, were talking during landing, overcorrected, plane went down, your loved one was on that plane. How do you feel about that? Angry. Yeah, who are you angry at?
The airlines, the pilots.
Okay, yep, the pilots, they should have done what they were supposed to do. They should have followed the rules. The airline should have enforced the rules better. They should have had better training. They should have had better safety. So yeah, it feels a little different, right? Okay, now your loved one died on a plane that was hijacked and intentionally crashed. How does that feel?
Horrible.
It's worse, right? For most people, that's going to feel worse, right? Because what could be worse than knowing not only did your loved one die, but someone got something out of it. Someone wanted that to happen. Almost everyone I've ever talked to about this has had that same reaction. Like, this is kind of a spectrum from, terrible to more terrible to most terrible. I did have one person once say, when I was doing this thought experiment, to me, honestly, the negligent one feels worse because it was just so stupid. It was just such a waste. No one did get anything out of it, which I understand that. And I think that's such a great example of the point I made about needing to keep an eye out for those individual differences. But generally, you can sort of expect to see this kind of pattern of worsening reactions. And we certainly know that rates of people who go on to get extreme reactions like PTSD, that is much, much more likely after a human-caused intentional disaster. All right. Just another kind of finer point on cause, just given the field that you all are in. I think important also to recognize some of the special characteristics around disease outbreaks, whether that's a natural, infectious disease like a flu kind of thing, a bioterrorism attack, whatever it might be. Radiological exposure certainly has the same effect. There's so much uncertainty and anxiety around these events that you can expect to see a lot of kind of lasting negative reactions around them, at least kind of while the process is going on. Because some of these, first of all, just the thought that I've taken something into my body that might make me sick is just so creepy for people to think about. And whether that is, I'm going to get the flu in a week. SUNY New Paltz is currently having a mumps outbreak. We're up to 16 students with mumps right now. There's a lot of anxiety, yeah. And they were all vaccinated also. But that's just really, anxiety inducing. Even more so was I exposed to something that's going to give me cancer a year from now, or 10 years from now, or 30 years from now. It's going to impact fertility. All of these factors are just very, very disturbing. And then we know that sometimes they are going to require social practices like isolation or quarantine, which are also very upsetting and anxiety-inducing. And for the professionals, there's that balancing act between meeting your professional responsibilities as a healthcare provider, and then your own fears and anxieties, and then your family's fears and anxieties for you. So we don't have time to get into this in more detail, but again, just to kind of think about these additional factors that are likely to come into play if this comes up. And I'll just give a little plug. Infectious disease outbreaks is going to be the topic of both the DOH webcast in January and the IDMH conference in April. So keep an eye out if you're interested in learning more on this topic. We'll get into these a lot more this year. All right, and then our third characteristic is, was it expected or not? Did we get a warning for it? And thinking about this in terms of what kinds of events we're likely to get warnings for, these are almost always going to be natural events, because if we got a warning for a human-caused event, we could potentially prevent it from happening, or at least get people out of the area where the bomb threat occurred or something like that. So generally these are going to be for weather-related events, but of course not all weather-related events do provide a warning. Usually, obviously, it's good if we get a warning. It gives us a chance to take protective action, to evacuate, to shelter in place, get out of harm's way, whatever. And it also just gives us that chance to psychologically prepare and just kind of get into that mindset like, okay, I need to brace. I need to be ready that something is going to happen and that I'm going to need to deal with. The problem is that making that psychological shift to, yeah, they're saying something bad is going to happen is really, really hard. I mean, think about any disaster warning you've ever gotten. Okay, they're saying X event is approaching and I need to do Y. That puts you in this horrible kind of position of having to, first of all, accept that X might happen and might cause whatever damage we know X is likely to cause, and then to decide whether to do Y. So let's say evacuate, which is often going to be what's recommended. What's involved in evacuating? Is it easy to pick up your family and get away from the threat? Absolutely not. I mean, where are you going to go? Where are you going to stay? How far are you going to have to travel? Do you have transportation? Can you afford gas or tickets or whatever? What are you going to do with the pets? That's a huge one that prevents people from evacuating if they can't take their pets with them. Are you going to go stay at a Red Cross shelter? Has anyone actually been in a Red Cross shelter that's been, not staying necessarily, but volunteering or, are they comfy? No. I mean, they do the best they can. It is not an environment you want to be in if you can avoid it, especially if you've got kids or your elderly parents or anyone who's, or yourself. Are you going to go stay with your in-laws? How long? All of these factors are going to weigh in, and how unpleasant those actions are going to be to take, and you don't know that it's going to be worth it because maybe the last time it happened, it was a false alarm. So there's this huge risk of people just kind of going into denial when they get that warning and not following that action. It's understandable. They have very valid reasons for not following it. But then if they should have followed it and they didn't, huge amounts of self-blame, of guilt, of shame. I could have prevented this from happening to my family if only I had listened. And you're also getting that message from other people. As I said before, you could have prevented this from happening. So that's a big downside to warnings. And this drives emergency managers crazy. We told them they needed to leave and they didn't. Well, they had their reasons for not leaving, and we need to kind of understand that and try and overcome them. Flip side for the unexpected events, something comes out of nowhere. People are blindsided by it, they're shocked, they're stunned, they're more likely to be injured because they didn't have that chance to take any protective action. Often people will just be kind of unable to function. Gus talked about people being sort of dazed and kind of unable to participate in their own recovery for a little while they're just absorbing what happened. And with these, often there is that sense of helplessness, very much like the natural events. We didn't see this coming, and therefore this could happen again at any time, and therefore I always have to be on guard against this happening again. So people can get into this kind of hypervigilance that is not a healthy way to live and function. The theoretical upside of unexpected events is there shouldn't be that sense of guilt, because you didn't not take action, no one told you to take action. However, there's often these kind of cognitive distortions. I had a really funny feeling that morning. I knew I shouldn't have let him get on that plane. The animals were acting weird. And those are all sort of control mechanisms. Like, okay, you caught me by surprise this time, but now I know the warning signs and I'm going to be on the lookout for them myself. And I'm not going to get fooled again. So again, understandable, but it places a lot of stress on people. Useful to say something like, it's really understandable that you're feeling this way given the terrible event that you just experienced. A lot of other people are feeling in a similar way when they go through something like this. Most people do start to feel better after a little bit of time passes, but if you're not starting to feel better, or if you want to talk to someone right now, here's what we can do for you. Here's referral information. Here's who you can talk to. Here's who I will introduce you to. Because basically that validates what they're going through. It acknowledges how painful and terrible it is. It gives the expectation that they'll feel better, but it also gives them resources for help if they decide that they do need that. So I hope that will be a guiding principle. All right, so very briefly looking at extreme reactions. For most people, these really do resolve over time. We don't give a time frame for that. It's not like, okay, it's a week later, it's a month later, whatever. But for most people, there's going to be this kind of gradual improvement over time. And it's that kind of process of adjustment that we expect to see. Some people, though, don't recover over time. They may even get worse over time, or they may just be having such an extreme level of reactions that they really do need further assistance. So what we're going to talk about here, just very briefly, this is not part of PFA, but this is part of that, here's where PFA ends and referral begins, which is an important part of PFA, recognizing the limits of what this teaches you. Again, back to the first aid analogy, I can learn basic medical first aid, clean up the wounds as Gus described, but if that person broke their leg, I can't help them with that. I need to connect them with someone who really can't do that. So post-traumatic stress disorder, I think that's probably familiar to everybody at this point. It's become such a kind of part of culture now. Acute stress disorder is basically PTSD-like symptoms in the first 30 days after the event occurs, because you can't formally diagnose PTSD until 30 days afterwards, 30 days after the symptoms begin. Depression and anxiety are important to recognize because those are conditions that it's entirely possible the survivor had already been coping with before they went through the disaster. Rates of those conditions are very, very high in our culture. So those are people who definitely are somewhat more vulnerable for a return or a worsening of symptoms in those conditions, but they're not doomed to that. They may be having a post-traumatic stress reaction that is simply the same as everyone else who's been through the event. So you want to kind of reassure them that they're not destined to be going into another, say, major depressive episode or something like that. But at the same time, you want to make sure they get any medications restored, counseling restored, whatever it was that kind of kept them functioning before. So those are kind of watchful, Then complicated grief and traumatic bereavement. These can occur when there's a loss, specifically a death, but it could be another type of loss. It could be pet loss, loss of the home, etc. But where there's kind of this, traumatic bereavement is where the nature of the loss was in a traumatic manner, and the person gets kind of fixed on that traumatic nature. What did my loved ones suffer when they were dying? And they can't get beyond thinking about that in order to start processing the loss itself and go through the kind of more typical bereavement process. So that is certainly something where professional assistance can be needed and beneficial. And complicated grief is kind of where they just get stuck. Just like the post-traumatic reactions, normally grief kind of starts resolving gradually over time. People with complicated grief, we think of them as just, they're not moving in that process. It's like it just happened. So that also is something where grief counseling could be beneficial. The substance abuse disorders, this one's kind of mildly positive news in that there's generally very little evidence that people are likely to acquire a new substance use habit after a disaster. Some people will self-medicate a little bit, maybe go through a period of drinking more than they used to, something like that. But very few people develop an abuse disorder in response to a traumatic experience. However, people who had a history of that or who currently have an abuse issue are at much, much higher risk of either relapsing or increasing their use. So in terms of thinking about helping people with this, we don't need to be so concerned that everyone's going to start abusing drugs or alcohol, but the people who have a history of that, we definitely want to pay attention to them, reconnect them with 12-step programs, again, counseling, whatever it was that was helping them previously. Okay, any questions? I know I'm talking a mile a minute. Yes?
I have a question, but when you were talking about basically the survivor reaction, one area you didn't discuss was that can impact their reaction to the event is how well it was responded to by the agencies that now are responsible.
Yes.
And if they had a plan or did not have a plan, or whether there was a declaration and funding available, that can create huge problems.
Yes.
And prolonged stress.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes into, what was the response and how that differs for different people and different events. But right, I mean, a lot of reactions are going to be tied to just what resources are available afterwards. I think people often have incredibly inaccurate expectations of what FEMA is going to do or what their insurance companies. I mean, how many stories have we heard about people's insurance companies basically abandoning them after something happens? And that really is like a second disaster, secondary trauma, and there can be tons of anger and that sense of betrayal as well. So yeah, that certainly can be a big factor. Thanks. Yeah.
Have your studies focused at all upon how to push these efforts or encourage people to take PFA type classes? I mean, we all are here for a reason.
Right.
But how do we get the rest of the folks who say, well, it's too big of a problem, I would never do CPR on somebody, I would never do psychological first aid on someone or work with them that way?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that. I mean, certainly you're going to have people who are going to be more inclined to help than others. I think a lot of why we're kind of focusing this at creating these PFA training policies is so that can be done at kind of the organizational or institutional level. Because you might have someone who's going to say, PFA, anything with the word psychological in it, nope, I'm out. But if they get the training and get the understanding, maybe that will sort of make them realize, okay, this is not so daunting or so scary. So I think that's why we really want to, get it.
This is also not really focusing on the general public. I don't think we're proposing to train everybody in the public in psychological first aid. This is for people who are part of a response, so they're either volunteers or work for an agency, and so you can reach them beforehand with training.
Although I would like everyone in the general population to be trained as well.
And that's another issue.
Right. Tracy, can we get funding for that? Yeah.
And this is part and parcel of the foundational education we need. So we have found that we need for disaster response.
Right. I mean, to me, PFA is just a force multiplier. If you have, part of I think what it is just giving people the confidence to go out and deal with the public. We had one of the first trainings we did with this in Saranac Lake. There was a participant in the audience who, I love this example. He was a fighter turned emergency manager, and at the end of the session, he said, I never, ever want to have to actually do this, but I'm so glad that I know what my staff is going to have to be doing in terms of dealing with the public. So again, I think that kind of education about it, again, just getting it out there and getting that buy-in for it. So again, glad you're all here. Yeah.
I think there's an assumption too, for example, in mental health, there's an assumption that every mental health person is going to feel comfortable in this kind of situation.
Right.
And they're not necessarily.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's a great point. That is why we have specific disaster mental health trainings for people with a mental health background, because just the fact that you may be the most experienced, wonderful social worker or counselor or CASAC or whatever in the world, that does not mean when you walk into a shelter that has 500 incredibly distraught people who are angry and, whatever, that doesn't mean you're prepared for that. So that's why the specific training, even for the mental health professionals, is so important. Yeah, good point. Okay, let's see, I know we're sort of technically at lunch, should I go on for another few minutes and then let people get lunch, or I can get lunch and come back and talk? How do you want to handle this?
It's here. So
Okay.
you want the group decide or whether they want
Okay, want me to,
Why don't you go for a little
okay,
while
I'll come to the next
to get through
natural.
up to the PFA training.
Okay.
So,
All right, so this is, I always feel like this is the slide where we just can't do this one well in kind of a universal way. Because, right, I mean, certainly people may self-identify. They might say, okay, yes, you've just given me, you've given them the little, here's what to do if you aren't feeling better, you want to talk to someone soon. And they say, yeah, I think I need to talk to someone. Totally wonderful, admirable that they have that recognition, because there is unfortunately still some stigma about seeking mental health among many people. So whether it's that they self-identify or that you just recognize, okay, I'm really concerned about this person, they seem like they're not doing okay, or they're alone, or, you know, whatever other risk factor there seems to be, you know, I think that this person needs more help than I can give them in my PFA role. How do you do that? You know, what resources are available? We can't kind of tell you that, but just in thinking about if you're doing this training within your own facility, depending on the setting, what are those resources likely to be? You know, if you're talking about a Red Cross shelter, they will theoretically have a disaster mental health person there to make that referral to. If it's in your hospital, hopefully you have hospital social workers to make that referral to. But, you know, you just need to kind of think about what would that be so that in your own training for people, you can provide that information. And also just things like resource lists. You know, that the referral might not be to a mental health professional, it could be to spiritual care, or it could be to, you know, it could be to FEMA, it could be to just whatever is the need that they have. It doesn't necessarily have to be a behavioral health need, although that's certainly what we're focusing on here. All right, so very briefly, some risk factors of people who are likely to not have that kind of typical recovery pattern, but have the more extreme or more long-lasting reactions. I talked about the dose-response relationship, and we certainly know that having a lack of resources, and in particular social support, is a really big risk factor. That could be because the person didn't have a lot of social support to begin with. You know, maybe they were isolated, maybe they were new to the community, maybe they're an immigrant, maybe they just don't have many friends or family, maybe they're elderly and don't have, you know, their support network is kind of diminished. Or maybe they had that support network, but that's been destroyed or impacted by the disaster. You know, one of the things with disasters is if my house burns down, I know that my neighbor will take me in and let me stay there until I get stabilized again. If my whole block has burned down in a major fire, my neighbor's not available to help me. I'm not available to help my neighbor. So that kind of natural support is gone at that point. So what can we do to kind of fill in for that and overcome that impact? And then we also recognize certain vulnerable populations. Yeah.
So do you feel, or have you seen any evidence based on our changing culture that the risk factor is going up for that because of a lack of involvement with other organizations like churches, or family structure has been diminished and reduced?
Right.
So is
Right.
that any evidence that extreme reactions are increasing?
I think there's certainly recognition that the size of vulnerable populations is increasing. I don't know that anyone specifically studied the reactions per se, but yeah, I think we can definitely say, I mean, obviously just demographics with the aging population, that is a factor that we are so unprepared for. There's some attention that we need to be more prepared for it, but we certainly are not there yet. But yeah, I think a lot of the other factors you talk about, you know, even if you have families, how many families now all still live in the same town, let alone the same house? No, the adult kids are elsewhere, so maybe they're trying to look out for elderly parents, but hard to do that from halfway across the country. And yeah, I think the less participation in organizations, social clubs, churches, spiritual care, all of those, I think that's probably a big factor. I don't have empirical evidence about that, but I think that's likely. And of course now so much of our social connections are through social media, which can be fine, but again, that person's not there to like physically lend a helping hand. So yeah, I think it's definitely something we need to be conscious of. Yeah. Okay, so what do we mean by these vulnerable populations? So generally, these are groups where often it's not that it's a psychological vulnerability that they have, it's some factor about who they are, their age, whatever, that means that they have more intense needs during disasters. Disasters tend to overwhelm response capacity in general, and then you have these groups that have more intense needs, and so of course they're likely to slip between the cracks and then have worse reactions as a result. So things like evacuating, I talked about sheltering conditions in general. If you're an elderly person or a person with mobility problems or pain or cognitive impairment, those are really difficult settings to be in. People who lose access to their medications, we're all supposed to have a go bag packed with our, whatever, a week's worth of medications and backup hearing aid batteries and all of that stuff. I won't make you raise your hands to ask how many people have them, but not many people actually do. And even just things like, if I lose my glasses in a disaster, I am now a handicapped person. Think about that. I mean, that's a daunting thought. So something as simple as that can cause me to be a vulnerable population, a member of a vulnerable population. So I kind of always want to point this out because it's not that the person has these characteristics and that automatically means they're going to have a worse reaction. It's that they have these characteristics, which mean maybe they don't have as strong a support system. You know, the elderly person who's living far away from their children, etc. Maybe because of all this, you know, they weren't able to evacuate, therefore they had an increased dose, and so it's that dose-response relationship. Maybe because they had a disability and were underemployed, they did not have financial resources to support their recovery. You know, even just think about people on lower SES, maybe often are renting rather than owning their homes. That means it's not even their choice whether to rebuild or not. And now there's limited housing stock in an area. So these are all just factors that are just going to increase the person's distress and be more likely to be associated with that reaction. So what we can try and do is address some of these mediating factors and hopefully prevent the worst reactions. So these are just some of the main groups that are recognized as being vulnerable. Kids, we sort of used to say, kids are resilient, they bounce back. Well, they bounce back if they have a supportive home caregiving situation that's going to buffer them from the stress of the disaster. If they don't, they are incredibly vulnerable because, you know, we think about adults kind of go through something bad happens, this was their baseline, they have kind of a diminishment in functioning. Over time, hopefully they get back to that baseline and they're okay again. Well, with kids, they weren't supposed to be at a baseline. They were supposed to be developing. So something happens here, kid, you know, loses functioning, maybe they get back here, but in the meantime, they should have been here. So it's really hard sometimes for a child to kind of catch up from that, and that can be, you know, academically, social development, emotional development, all of these factors. So we definitely recognize that kids need attention and support. Was just talking about older adults. Again, all of the various reasons they may have worse reactions, and especially with older adults, there's often tremendous resistance to evacuating because they know they're not going to be okay in the shelter. You know, maybe they were living at home and able to hang on and be independent while they were in their comfortable environment, but they know that once they get out of that, they may never be able to get back to that again. So we'll see, one of the scenarios we'll have today is an adult who's just refusing to evacuate, basically saying, I'd rather die in my home than leave. And that is not an unrealistic situation. Certainly people with physical disabilities, just again, all of these kind of practical elements, mental disabilities, I talked about substance addiction before, people living in poverty, just overall lack of resources, and the recent immigrants, that one maybe because of language barriers where they don't understand understand the warning, understand what they're supposed to do. That could be because of concerns about legal or immigration status if they're not here legally, but also just, you know, maybe they came from a country with an abusive government, and so they are used to mistrusting authorities rather than trusting them. Are they going to listen to warnings? Are they going to feel comfortable interacting with the system? So these are all topics that, you know, we could spend a week on each of these groups very easily, but just basically be aware, especially in your own community, who are you likely to deal with? Do you have a large elderly population? Do you have, there's a town not far from New Paltz that has a major residential program for children and adolescents with autism. That's going to be a very special population that's going to have some intensive needs in the time of disaster. Just, you know, who is it? How can you make those plans in advance? If it's something like the recent immigrants, is there a spiritual leader or just a community leader that you can make a connection with to build that trust, etc. Just think about that as you do your plans. Cultural competence, another topic that we could spend eons on, but basically kind of main points with this. We sometimes think about culture in terms of behaviors Is it okay to make eye contact with someone, to touch someone, for a man and a woman who aren't related to, have a conversation with each other, et cetera. I also think it's important to think about cultural differences in meaning making and how do people understand the disaster. That can certainly be tied to religious beliefs, but was this God's will? Was this karma? Was this punishment for me for something I did wrong? Punishment for something my ancestors did wrong? Who is responsible for justice? Is that human beings' role? Is that only God's role? Will karma take care of that as well? All of these kind of different factors that are going to influence how the person will process what they've been through. So once again, if you have a significant population in your area, just thinking about how to kind of plan for that. Bonnie.
I just wanted to add that I think it's important to look at cultural competence also in terms of organizational culture, because if you're going to work with first responders, fire, EMS, police, they have a very specific culture, and it's important to understand that and know that and be comfortable within that, because otherwise they will reject you very quickly.
That is an excellent point. Thank you. Yeah. Not an easy group necessarily to connect with. Great. All right. So I'll do this really quickly because many of you did take the online training. If you didn't, I would encourage you to do that, especially if you're thinking about using that with your own group, but we'll come back to that. But basically, this is kind of a major study that came out about a decade ago. This was done by 20 of the top trauma psychologists, trauma responders, mental health professionals, trauma and disaster mental health professionals globally. So this was a real kind of epic, landmark study. And they basically looked at all of the literature that was out there on successful early interventions and unsuccessful ones, and then also included their own clinical experiences. And they identified these 5 principles of early intervention. So what they found was kind of common to all of the effective ones was promoting that sense of safety. So that's going back to what I talked about before. Until you feel safe, you can't actually start to process. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Promoting calm. Again, just kind of reducing that chaos. I feel unsafe. Again, bringing down, we definitely know that emotions are contagious. If I am talking to someone who is very upset, whether they're distressed, whether they're angry, whatever it is, it's very hard for me not to kind of pick up on their emotions, on their breathing patterns. So being conscious of that and doing everything that we can as responders to bring that down on the premise that will then be contagious and that will bring down their arousal level. The efficacy, this is really kind of empowering people, reminding them that this happened to them. They might be feeling helpless right now, but they're not a helpless person. They were a perfectly normally functioning person before. They will get back to that again, and taking steps, whatever we can do to kind of restore that sense. And that's both the individual efficacy and then that community-based efficacy. We will help each other out. We will be here for each other. We will get each other through this. The connectedness, this goes back to the social support issue that I talked about before, that sense just of, we need to have at least one person we can rely on. We don't need more than that. So, some people have huge circles of friends. Some people are fine with just that one, but, kind of reminding people they do have that one. But if that one is not available, what are alternatives? And sometimes maybe we stand in for them temporarily at least. And then instilling hope, and that's a really tricky one. It's not hope that it didn't happen. It's not hope that, everything's going to be all right again, because you don't know if it's going to be all right again, or hopefully it's going to be all right, but probably not in the exact way that they're thinking of right now. So having that kind of realistically based sense of instilling hope. Okay, things will get better. You won't always feel the way you're feeling this way. You have a place to sleep tonight. Even if it's not the ideal place to sleep, kind of whatever that might be. Again, getting that kind of forward thinking again. So those are the principles that really underpin PFA. PFA itself, before I get into the specific elements we'll be practicing today, it is universal, meaning it can be applied to anyone, it can be delivered by anybody, it works with people of any age. It can work with first responders. Basically this is not targeted in any specific way. It's very short term. It's very focused on this interaction with this person in front of me, because it's entirely possible I will never see this person again. This is not case management. This is not planning, for their future. This is, what does this person need right now, and what can I possibly do to help provide what they need right now? It is very practical. We always talk about it as working Maslow's hierarchy. If someone is cold and wet, they cannot be thinking about the next step until they are dry and warm. It's very, I think, akin to social work in that way. What is the person's need? Whatever that need is, let me see if I can address that. And it's very low on Maslow's hierarchy. It's the first 2 or 3 levels. This is not about restoring the person's sense of self-esteem. That can come later. This is about, what do they need right then to again, activate their own recovery. I think we sort of talked about the third or the fourth point sufficiently, but again, that premise that, something happens, stuff gets in the way of people being involved in their own recovery. So how can we get that stuff out of the way so that the natural process can take over? Last points are important, and especially this is important in terms of when you are training people in this. This is not a process. This is not a checklist that you go through. This is not a series of steps where first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. It's a bunch of tools to have in your toolkit. Things that you might do for this person if that's what they need, if that's what's going to be helpful. People sometimes kind of get fixed on this, like, oh, well, I didn't attend to their safety needs, so I must have done it wrong. No, if that's not an issue for this particular person, that's not an issue. We just want to give people these steps or these elements so that they do kind of have them to think about and to draw on. And another point is there are a lot of different models of PFA. Red Cross has their own model. Office of Mental Health does, which is the one that we'll basically be using. There's a bunch out there, and a bunch of the online training courses might use slightly different language than the one that we have on our worksheet that we'll look at in a bit. They are all completely consistent in spirit. The underlying principles are all the same. They just describe them in different ways. They might have a different number of elements. But people shouldn't get thrown off if the language we're using is slightly different than what they learned in their online course. Yeah.
I do think, and I can only speak for, I'm in Livingston County, Livingston County, even though we may not see these people again, I think we're also very much at risk of seeing people we do know.
Right.
As opposed to maybe a big city, if you're EMS or fire, your chance of responding, and it might be somebody you know, someone you're related to. I don't know that would change, but I think that puts maybe in our smaller communities a little bit of an extra challenge.
That is a good point. But you're seeing someone at this particularly vulnerable moment for them, and then you're going to end up bumping into them in the grocery store or interacting professionally in some way. Yeah. So I think that underlies just that need to be respectful and genuine and right. I think again, like I always think these roles could so easily be reversed. It could be me who just lost my house and they're the one comforting me or trying to help me. So that's kind of a good underlying premise for everything. But yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. All right. Last point that I will make, and then we'll break for lunch. So these are the elements that we're going to be looking at when we do our exercise after lunch. So making a connection, this is harder than it might seem. How do you initiate a conversation with someone who's standing in front of their destroyed house saying everything I own is gone, or someone who is sitting on a cot in an emergency shelter, completely checked out and not paying any attention to what's going on around them. It just can be a lot more challenging. So sort of thinking about how would you actually do that, you certainly want to do that by introducing yourself and identifying what your professional role is so that they know you're not just some random person, but you're actually there in some professional capacity. One of the tricky things that comes up for mental health people is, do you identify yourself as mental health or not? And generally what we say is not at the beginning, as long as what you're doing is at the level of PFA with them, you're often more likely to sort of drive the person away if you identify in that way. However, if it gets to the point where you're kind of going beyond that into what you would consider more of a formal mental health conversation, you absolutely do need to. Otherwise, they're going to maybe feel betrayed or lied to or something like that. But even just if you're not mental health, how do you kind of start that connection? I talked about attending to physiological needs. Give them water, give them blankets, connect them with dry clothing. Figure out how can they get their glasses back, their medications, whatever else it might be. And that also could certainly involve making sure that they're not having any medical issues that haven't been identified. Are they having a panic attack or a stress attack, or were they injured in the disaster and they haven't even realized it yet? I mean, that certainly sometimes happens. The safety needs, that is both emotional safety and physical safety. So, people will want to go back into their neighborhoods and see what condition their house is, but maybe there are down power lines or other conditions that make that unsafe. Or maybe their house is full of mold because of flooding. So it's, some of that is literal safety. Some of that is also kind of that emotional safety. I gave the example of the person standing in front of their house saying everything's gone. Well, it's like a small thing you can do is maybe just get that person to turn around so their back is to their house, so they're at least not seeing it at that moment. So you can start to have a conversation with them and start to see what they need and how you can kind of get them out of that and into a more appropriate setting. The providing acknowledgement, recognition, and reassurance is very important. You do want to validate that they've had these losses. You do want to acknowledge, yeah, you went through something really awful. And I think this especially comes up when there's this kind of range of losses in a community, and someone might be saying, well, I'm okay, I lost my pets, but my house is pretty much all right, but my neighbor lost his house, excuse me, so, go talk to him, he's the one who really needs your help. Well, yeah, but you lost your pets. I mean, that's a tremendous loss, and that needs to be recognized and mourned, and not kind of set aside because it's less bad than other people's. Remaining calm, I talked about this already, just how do you kind of keep yourself steady when maybe there's just chaos around you, a lot of distractions, even just simply, thinking about being in, whether it's a crowded, emergency department waiting room or a shelter or whatever it might be, staying focused on the person you're talking to and not getting distracted, and because they're going to pick up on that. That can be really difficult. I always find when I start to realize I'm picking up on someone's breathing, that's when I need to kind of settle myself down, when I start sort of breathing really shallowly. And also remaining calm when they're angry at you, because you're sort of the face that's there. That we'll come back to that in more detail. The providing warmth, empathy, and genuineness, that goes to the point I was just talking about. This is a human being who I need to respect. It's that kind of Rogerian, people are good, and you can't fake this kind of response, or they're going to pick up on that. Empowering the survivor. This goes back to just restoring that sense of efficacy for them. What can you do to kind of kickstart that? I always like to share this, what I learned from a colleague who used to be with the Red Cross in New York City, who's an incredibly experienced responder. She taught me what we always call the lemonade rule, which is, yes, okay, you want to see to somebody's physiological needs. So it's very easy to do that by handing them a bottle of water, right? What she taught me was, okay, go to them and say, do you want water or do you want lemonade? What does that force the person to do? Make a choice, yeah. And it's a minor choice. It doesn't matter if they choose it wrong on this particular thing, but it is reminding them, I have agency in my life. I'm not just this passive victim waiting for handouts from people, which is often how people feel after a disaster. Take the lemonade rule and expand it however you possibly can, but it's that kind of thing. What can they do? What can they do to help other people? Can they help out in the shelter? Whatever it is to just kind of restore that sense that they can do things for themselves and their community. Information, we've got 2 points on this because it is so important for people after a disaster. They are desperate to find out what happened? Why did it happen? Who was responsible? Is it over? When can I get home? What was the damage that was done? When is FEMA arriving? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are both the big sort of existential, why did this happen questions, and the very practical, where am I going to sleep tonight questions. So you are definitely going to be called on to provide information. Some of our scenarios, it's where is my husband? Where is my daughter? So obviously, sort of when people are missing or remains haven't been identified, that's going to be, of course, the most urgent kind of information people need, but it can go kind of across the board. So being aware that they want the information and they're not going to be happy if you can't provide it. But what do you say if you don't have the information they're looking for? Yeah, I mean, first you say, I don't know. You can say, I don't know, and I'm sorry, I understand that's really frustrating for you that I don't know. But, the situation is unfolding, we're still just getting details in, we're trying to find out what we can. I do know that there was going to be a briefing at 3 o'clock where whoever is going to release as much information as they have, or I don't know, but I think I know where I can find that out for you, let me go and do that. Or I don't know, but do you want to borrow my phone so that you can, whatever. So it's, I don't know is often going to have to be your answer because you're simply not going to know, but it's I don't know and whatever you can do to kind of help them. And of course you have to make sure what you're giving out is accurate and that you're authorized to give out that information as well. Tracy.
Yes, earlier you mentioned that it's important to not only address the mental health needs of the survivor, but also the responder. And so can you speak to or think of any needs or tools that may be unique to the responder? And then as the coordinators here begin to consider the different trainings for their staff, do they really need to work with trainings that specifically address the psychological first aid needs of the responder?
Yes, I would say that, first of all, anything with the responders, okay, first of all, there are some trainings that are targeted, like I think in our training guide, we've got some that are more for responders. I think there's just one in there, I'll need to look back at that. I think a lot of that is working with that community and working through their supervisors to see what are they going to need, what are they going to be receptive to. A really important point in terms of thinking about responders is while the response is ongoing, like yes, some of this can help them and you certainly want to give them the chance to ventilate and to validate what they're going through and some of that, they have to stay focused on the mission. They're in a very different place than the survivors of the event itself, who for them it's now, okay, it's pretty much over and now we need to start focusing on the future and on adjustment. In many cases for the responders, they're in it still, and so they sort of can't pause yet. So for them it might be more of a slightly longer term, or mid-range or longer term follow-up. Bonnie and Dan, you work a lot with this population. You want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right when you say that they have to stay focused. And it's important that we keep them up here in their cognitive realm and not taking it out to a more affective level, at a time when they have a big job in front of them. On occasion, I've been able to provide sort of just immediate on-site intervention for like maybe as short as 5 minutes tops for somebody that just has that moment. But it's sort of like you turn that around for them and kind of move them forward again, and they're fine, they're good. I think one of the best ways to ensure that psychological first aid will be accepted in the aftermath of a disaster is to get in there and do some trainings and education before an event happens, because that's the only way you're going to connect. It's the only way you're going to kind of put a face to it. That's the only way you're going to kind of demystify that whole notion that, it's not all touchy-feely stuff, which they don't really like, right? I don't either, actually. But I think that that's an important element, because that's your foot in the door pre-event. And then they're more likely to accept something post-event or during.
Right. Okay. Great. Yeah.
I took an emotional survival for law enforcement course because I work in the jail with deputies. And one of the things about them that I think can be frustrating for people is they see a problem, fix a problem. That's their gig, and so it's difficult for them to get their brotherhood. They have their thing, and to introduce some of this stuff is very foreign to them, and it makes them very vulnerable. And when they're on these kinds of scenes, they tell you what to do, you know, we have a training, it's that, I don't know what we call it, the CRAS training, and, you know, avoid, deny, defend, and situational awareness, and this is how they think. So they might say, you need to go, or you need to go, or you need to get, and that's a whole other dynamic.
Right.
And it's just because that's the way they do it,
Right,
you know, so.
right, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bit of a culture clash, at least in terms of, yeah, kind of first approaches to things, but I hope with some more education on both sides, because I think it's also important for us, however we're defining us, to understand why they are acting that way. As you said, that's how they're trained, they have to take command of the situation, that's their mission. So I think there's a lot more receptivity building kind of across the groups, but there's certainly room to go still. Yeah.
Probably need to wrap up.
Okay. We have one more comment there in the back, and then I'll.
I just want to make a point of, like, involving, like, peer supports in those professions. I work with law enforcement in Hanover County that does a bunch of briefings in jails after suicide and stuff like that. And having someone trained in that professional role as a peer mentor is hugely successful. So I would really encourage that in your other counties. So if you have sheriff's departments or paramedics or EMTs or local fire departments that are willing to participate in something like this, to be somebody that can facilitate this with a mental health person, kind of co-facilitating, that has really good success rates. And so I would highly encourage that.
Thank you. Here.
So, one other thought might be, this is an active shooter training, and it was a law enforcement officer, it was an MSW. So he did an awesome job of explaining the psychological piece of it. And, you know, coming from the law enforcement, they could explain both sides of it. And I know he's one that attends the IDMA training, so there are folks out there that may have that dual training.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. So just wrapping this up very quickly, I think I've talked plenty about accessing social support, but, you know, encouraging people to reach out to someone who's going to be positive social support. You don't want to encourage them to contact someone who's going to be blaming or punitive or, you know, make them feel guilty. So trying to feel that out. You know, I talked plenty about the referral, just customizing that for your particular facility and how that's going to work there. And then how do you end the conversation? You know, maybe it's been a 5-minute conversation, maybe it's been an hour-long conversation, maybe this person has just told you about everything they've been through and lost. How do you kind of extricate yourself from that in a way that leaves them feeling as stable as possible? If possible, you never want to leave them alone. You know, you want to have them at least be with someone who can provide some support, whether that's natural support or professional, et cetera. But basically just thinking about, okay, how am I going to kind of do this gracefully in a way that leaves them feeling positive about the interaction, which is not always easy to do either. So those are the PFA elements we're going to practice after lunch. So let's break. Mary, what are marching orders?
The lunch is down the last room on the left.
Okay.
Bring it back to the sort of working one.
Yeah, please bring it back, because we're a little bit behind now, so I think to get you out on time today, bring the lunch back here.
And I'll keep talking.
So give you a chance to eat it. I did that very quickly, didn't I? Do you have questions on how to use the guide? I mean, hopefully it's pretty self-explanatory. And the whole thing is on the thumb
Right.
drives.
Right, yes, and we are still in the process of finalizing this, and then I think the ultimate goal is to have it available online as well, so that all of these will be linked directly to the courses, so for even more ease of use. So I hope that seems like that's going to be helpful for people in terms of, you know, selecting, narrowing down, making that efficient. So that is great. Okay, so then I will move on so that we get back on our schedule to how to actually do the in-person practice part. And at this point, I do recommend in your folders, you've got facilitator guidelines, and then this packet that's got, has a worksheet, and then it has the 10 scenarios. If you're able to pull that out and follow along, that I would recommend. There's facilitator guidelines and then the worksheet and the 10 scenarios, which, oh, unless maybe you guys might have those stapled together as one. They're all in one?
Yes.
Ah, okay, sorry, all right. So what, facilitator guidelines is the top?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, great, and then that's all in there. Okay, good. All right, so first of all, just why are we putting so much emphasis on practicing PFA? As Gus said at the beginning, yeah, you could just require your people to take one of the online courses and be done with it, but we really, really don't think that that's sufficient. It is one thing to get kind of the didactic, talking through what those elements are. It is entirely different when you are suddenly in the position of trying to initiate that conversation and have that discussion and be supportive for that person who's in this state of very strong emotions. This is the line we always use. I can always tell when I'm teaching undergraduate students, I'm talking through the PFA elements, and I can just see them restraining from rolling their eyes at me like, duh, of course this is stuff that we would do to help somebody. But the thing is, when you get in that situation, common sense is not common in times of disasters. It's really easy to just clutch, to just get overwhelmed, to get paralyzed, to not know what to do. And so it really is important to have that practice so you kind of get that out of your system in that safe environment. And one of the things that happens a lot is people will be trying to do this for the first time, acting as the helper, and they will say something that they think, why did I just say that? That was a terrible thing I just said. So we want you to do that when you're pretending, not when you're actually trying to help someone who's in great distress, where you could actually potentially do some harm. And yeah, it's the confidence as much as the competence that I think this is really important for. And also the way that we do these exercises, with this 3-person scenario, people have the opportunity to act as the client, the survivor, as well as the helper, and also to serve as an observer, so you can really closely watch that interaction and focus on it while you're not just trying to think about what to say next. And I think being in those 3 different roles is very important as well. I've done this same scenario with, Palestinians and Israelis in the Middle East working together. That was an interesting one. People from all different response professions around New York State. I did it a couple weeks ago with a bunch of state funeral directors. That was an interesting group. It's a great example of how this is universal and how anyone can learn these skills. And everyone brings their own skills to it. Certainly people with more mental health background and experience tend to be more comfortable doing it, but everyone has something that they can bring to it. So I think doing that practice really, helps bring that out for people. So as I said, these are small group. Don't use the word role play. We shouldn't have it on here. It's kind of a trigger word for a lot of people. Experiential exercise, practice exercise, something like that. Whatever. Adult learning opportunities, whatever you want to call it. Don't call it that. But it is. But they don't need to know that. Right. Now, when you are doing this with your own people, the timing we suggest is having them do, so you'll form them into the groups, and we'll talk about that. Give them the scenarios. Then we suggest having each interaction take 10 minutes on one scenario, and then still within the small group, they would spend 5 minutes talking about it and processing it among themselves. Generally, the observer is going to be leading that, but talking about what was effective, what wasn't. The helper, the client also can talk about what worked for them, and so on. Then rotating, so then they switch roles. We have a visual on that in a second. And switch scenarios. Do the next one, again, 10 minutes and 5 minutes, switch again. One of the things we consistently find is that keeping control over that timing is very, very difficult. Sometimes people will finish early and move on to the next one before you've given them the cue. Depending on the physical space you've got, it can be hard to kind of give them the cue. It just, you need to sort of be flexible and try and keep them on that time frame while recognizing you're not going to have 100% compliance with that. But that is the goal. And then once they've done all three of the scenarios, then you'll come back together as the large group and process what that experience was. So back to our scenarios, which you've got in your packet. We spent a lot of time developing these different particular settings and situations. If you look at them, you can see for each one, you've got kind of, overview of what the actual setting is. So the first one is hospital-based family assistance center following worksite explosion, assisting a family member. The way that these are meant to work is that the person who's acting as the client is the one who has the full sheet. They will read the scenario description to the rest of the group, so that everyone in the group knows what the basic premise of the scenario is. Then we provide sample client statements, which the client can use to kind of fuel their part of the discussion. These are not meant to be a formal script. They're meant to be talking points, points of getting the conversation going. Sometimes we find people will just sort of say one and then say the next and then say the next. That's not really the intention of these. It's that, you say a statement, then the helper has to bounce off of that, provide PFA in response to that statement. You can follow that discussion where it goes, and then you can come back to the next one, or, selectively as appropriate. So does that make sense with what the client is doing?
It's more like an
An
exercise.
inject, yes, exactly. It's more like an inject, right? It's not that they have to say that. It's that here's something they can say to kind of move it to the next level or follow that discussion along. Right. Now the observer is going to be using this worksheet to take notes on that interaction. So they are basically just jotting down maybe what was done well, what maybe something else they could have said. And you want to reiterate with this, the point is not check, 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 check. The point is, were they choosing the appropriate elements for this particular setting and not getting caught up by, trying to hit every one of them. The helper certainly can use this same worksheet, which they'll have a copy of along with their own scenario. They can use this as a kind of cheat sheet, a kind of reminder. People often find that really, really helpful. Again, you're thinking, what the hell am I going to say next? Oh, I can focus on empowering the survivor, providing information. But you want to remind them to stay focused on the conversation, not reading through this and trying to figure out how they're going to address it. So is that all clear about how that is supposed to go? Okay, and just another point on these scenarios is what you'll want to do when you're planning your own training. You'll get exposed to 3 of them today just in the process of doing this. You will want to read through all of them and pick the ones that are most appropriate for your setting, for your group, your staff, that they're most likely to respond to. Several of them are healthcare focused. Some of them are more traditional disaster response setting focused. So we do have, Family Assistance Center at a hospital looking for a missing person. Emergency shelter, we'll actually give you an example of that one in a minute. Disaster Recovery Center. Basically, just read through them. They all have different settings. They have different types of clients and different types of responders. In some cases, the responder's role is specified. Like there's, the hospital-based responders to mass shooting. In that one, the client is actually a pediatrics nurse who got called into a response to a mass shooting in her hospital, and it's now the next day, and she's dealing with her own reaction, and the helper is a hospital social worker. That is one that you would likely choose if you are working with hospital social workers. You probably wouldn't choose that one for others. Most of them, it doesn't specify the role of the helper, so the person should respond in whatever their actual role is. If they're a social worker, respond as a social worker. If they are a hospital security guard, respond as a hospital security guard who is seeing this situation happening. It's really, again, it's not pretending to be someone else. It's what would I do in this role? A couple of just other specific ones. There's one, the home care setting one. Sometimes people say, well, basically that one, you've got an elderly person who's being encouraged by her home aide to evacuate before a storm, and she's resisting. Very, very specific. For most of you, that probably wouldn't be one you would select. but the home health care agency asked us to include something on that, so that's why that's there. So again, you just want to think about what's best for you. And some of them are pretty intense. There's one with the school shooting. That's one where the client is, a mother who's there with her daughter. The daughter wasn't injured, but witnessed a shooting at her school the previous day in which her best friend was killed. That one triggers a lot of emotions for people. I would not use that one with kind of a general population audience, but mental health professionals might, be more appropriate for that. So again, just choose what's appropriate. Okay. So just a little bit of do's and don'ts, and these are outlined in your facilitator guidelines as well. Your goal is not to teach PFA. They should have gotten that from the online course they took. But it does seem useful to give people a little bit of a refresher beforehand, and especially these are sort of things that we have found are kind of pitfalls or traps people tend to fall into when they're learning to do this for the first time. So one of the big things that we see is this issue with people over-promising or over-reassuring. That can be at the very general level, like everything's going to be okay, or at the very specific level, FEMA's definitely going to pay for your house to be rebuilt. Neither of those things is true. So, but again, I totally get why people do this. We want to help. We want to tell the people what they want to hear. But what they want to hear is this didn't happen. Everything's going to be fine. My husband's okay. You can't say that stuff unless you know that it's true. So encouraging people to just be realistic, still to be as encouraging and supportive as they can, but it has to be reality-based. That's an important one. Then this one, I certainly hope no one would ever say something like, well, yeah, that's, sucks what you went through, but you should have heard what the last guy I was talking to experienced. We're not going to say that, right? But we sometimes, trying to be well-meaning, kind of, well, that doesn't sound too bad, or, it can be easy to kind of slip into that, just of not knowing what else to say. So this goes back to that validating what their losses were, no matter, and you might be thinking, well, they really didn't have it that bad relative to other people I've talked to, but you cannot say that, and you cannot express that through your nonverbal communication or anything like that. Changing the subject and filling up silence, these are really hard for people who aren't used to this kind of intense conversation with someone. But if there's this temptation to sort of switch the topic to something that's lighter than what they're talking about, or sometimes the person is quiet. Sometimes what they need is just to have a silent, supportive presence with them while they're thinking about what they've been through. And being able to serve that role is incredibly powerful, but it is incredibly difficult. So there's often this tendency to just start chattering about something, or again, switching to something that's easier to think about. So encouraging people to just stay with the client where they are, no matter how difficult that is. For you personally, it's a whole lot more difficult what they're going through. So trying to just be there, be present for them. And then the last one's very important also. We are often going to be the target of people's anger. Someone who's been through something terrible, yeah, maybe they're sad and distressed, but maybe they are also furious and frustrated and thinking the world is unfair and why did this happen and how could my government have let me down this way? And the anger is not targeted at you, but you're the person in front of them, and so you're the person who's going to get the brunt of it. And it's not easy at all. And it's, it doesn't make it okay that they're venting at you, but this is another one where I would say the roles could be reversed. It could be you who is so overwhelmed by your experience that you're just lashing out at whoever is in front of you. So try and be patient with that, try and be accepting, but also recognize the toll that takes and the need for self-care when that is going on. So those are my kind of basic do's and don'ts. Any
7 through 10 is it?
To say, the old, it's okay, it's gonna be all right, or
Yeah.
what can I do for you?
Yeah, yep.
If you stop and think, that's not the best thing to be.
Great, right? Okay, so adapting to this particular situation where, yeah, it's going to be okay is really not something you can say, yeah. So what, I mean, just thinking about now kind of how you would lead this discussion, the point of the post-discussion is not so much like what would be the right answer in this situation, more just what the experience was like for them. So you want to have this be kind of validating that, yeah, this is hard and scary. So I tend to do sort of focusing on when they were in each of the different roles, but you could certainly do that in a different way if something's more comfortable for you. But thinking about this, so when you were acting as helper, was there anything that you felt particularly competent at? It's nice to start with a strength-based approach. No. I saw something here.
Staying calm.
Staying calm. So you were good at staying calm.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
that's
think
good.
by virtue of the fact of what most of us
Right,
do.
right. No, but that doesn't necessarily mean that most of your staffs are going to have that skill necessarily. I mean, depending on what your staffs do. But yeah, great. Okay. Did anyone say something and then wish you could take it back instantly? What did you say that was not?
Well, it brought back an experience that I had at one time, because I was doing the one where trying to talk an elderly person out of the house, and I had actually had that kind of experience with a neighbor. And, I didn't know that person when I was trying to bring him out of his house, and since I felt a relationship with him, but I think it also made me think, you have to be out of your head a little bit, not out of your head crazy, but out of your personal experience in order to kind of evaluate why you're talking to the person.
Yeah, that's right. People often mention that, like you're trying to be engaged in the conversation, but you're also thinking about what you're going to say next. And it's like chess, you're thinking three steps down. How am I going to get this person to the point where they agree with what I'm trying to get them to agree with in that particular case? Yeah.
But still seem like you're engaged.
Right, exactly. Right. And that is definitely hard. And again, imagine doing that in the very chaotic setting as well. How about what was it like being the client? Did that seem like a useful part of the experience?
Still not out of it.
Oh no! Do we need to do a debriefing?
I think it's more challenging to be the client than it is necessarily the helper.
For you guys, yeah, because you're
We're
used to being
helpers.
right.
It's
Right.
hard for us to do that in a mock situation.
Right.
But trying to put yourself in that client position, I think sometimes it's a little bit harder and a little bit more stressful.
Yeah, right, but it is so important because to think about, wow, we are used to being the ones helping others, but now I'm the one who's feeling helpless and powerless and overwhelmed and upset and frustrated, and what does that mean I need from the person talking to me? And maybe that's different than I thought it was when I was just in the helper role. Yeah.
One suggestion I was thinking about, because sometimes you go to departments like an LHD or something like that, they don't have any experience people want to demonstrate, is that having some type of video clip that can be used in this training, it kind of goes through an example, so no matter how small or how large, you can have a really good example,
Mm-hmm.
and then have a quick talk about it afterwards before you break out into groups, so people really have a better understanding and feeling what's going to happen. Because I think sometimes when we do training across the state, I think at the state level, that is one way they can help out, is by giving those training examples, those training things that can be done at a state level and then distributed versus having to be made at a local level or trying to recreate it.
Right. Yeah, and I will say, right, we've definitely had requests for the video examples. Some of the trainings in the guide do include things like that, so you might think about that, until something else is developed, you might sort of look for something that does include that. But it's definitely, yeah, that's a good point.
It's been my experience, though, the training comes off a lot better if you do the video. And the people that you're working with are in that video that you've already, put them into that, because then it takes those people into that situation a lot faster.
Okay.
Because he's that's John, look how good he's doing, and so on and so forth, then they gotta realize, and so on and so forth. I
Right.
mean, that's a great example to use the video, but in my experience, when we do it ourselves with the people that are actually doing it together in the same place,
Right.
in our hospital, works better.
Okay, so if resources allow, that could be a great addition, yeah. Okay. I'm moving through this kind of more quickly than you likely would with your groups. But anything in terms of being the observer, was that a useful role to practice
Yeah.
as well? Why?
I think because we never get to be the disengaged observer.
Okay, yeah. Right, and that way you're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You're able to just really kind of focus on the dynamics. And also I think for the observer, being attuned to like the nonverbal stuff, the body language, all of that, I think really can reinforce how important some of those issues are that we don't always pay attention to as much. Other sort of general comments, and then I'll just do a couple of brief, again, kind of facilitation tips.
I think just using a familiar role, you know, a role that was consistent with what they do at their age.
Yeah. Yeah, and right, and that's why we had, you know, the 10 different ones. So hopefully among those you'll be able to find 3 that are going to be relevant and, you know, understandable. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was, so I was with the PFA. So, but it was one mother whose daughter was on a sports bus. So we had, she was playing the mother, and Matt was trying to help her, and just like physical dynamics, you know, so it's like maybe could be her daughter's age, you don't know that, but she's a motherly role, and he referred to her as ma'am consistently, and I thought, just like that title, you think, gotta respect calling her ma'am, like, that probably was like a really good rapport builder, even like, unconsciously, how we don't think about that sometimes.
Right.
For example, when we're at the restaurants, and I say when like waitresses love me honey, and they're like 18, I gotta get like flustered, and that
Right.
takes that, like, internally affects me, but for her, it probably was like reassuring and respectful.
Yeah.
And so I think in not even introducing themselves, it made that connection automatic.
Right, and using somebody's name,
Yeah.
you know, calling them by their name, and, you know, finding out what is the daughter's name, say, okay, we're gonna find out what we can about Cynthia or whatever, you know, use rather, so it sort of personalizes, lets them know you recognize that this is a human being that you're talking about. Also avoiding past tense language, never slipping into that, what was your daughter's name or anything like that. That's a huge one, certainly to be aware of. Yeah, no.
Well, using names will sometimes refocus that person too, because they hear that name.
Right, but you also want to refer to them the way they want to be referred. Like we have a tendency, I think, often to use first names and assume that's okay, but some people are offended by that. They want to be, you know, Mr. or Mrs. or whatever. So being conscious of all those issues, yeah. All right, so I'm just going to.
So I think those are the main points, easy to say, but questions or other comments at this point that you think would be helpful for us, or questions in general? We've gotten some good comments from people. Yes.
Just a general comment. I just want to say thank you for everything you've had a hand in all of this, because it's clear that it was an awful lot of work and a lot of time and effort had gone into it. And certainly being an advocate and proponent for psychological first aid, I am very pleased that you
Well,
guys
thanks.
hung in there and did this.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank the mental health folks who came today, the TA providers, you know, to help out with this, and your willingness to do this in the future. That's terrific. And part of this is to get that connection between the response community and the mental health provider community, not just at the professional mental health services level, but at the PFA ground level for frontline responders. Great. So please fill out the remainder of your evaluation form, because we take that seriously, and we do make changes and improve things based on your comments. And if the CME credit and the travel, talk to Mary if you want it. You can hand in your travel stuff now if you know what your mileage roughly is. Did you want us to make a comment, Mary?
Yeah, just the social work, make sure you sign out. Everybody else doesn't have to sign out.
For the social work CEUs, you do need to show that you were here for the whole time. So you got to sign in and sign out. So thanks, everybody. Have a safe trip home.
Thank you.